So we're going to start a series of talks at St Mark's, and it's all about kicking off our 250-year celebrations of Unitarians being in Edinburgh, which is absolutely marvellous. We've not been here for 250 years, but we've been in different places. And obviously that corresponds with another 250-year anniversary. And from our own congregation, we're very fortunate to have Professor Frank with us, who quite often features on the telly talking about these things and on In Our Time. So yeah, we are very, very honoured to.
Thank you, Janine, and it's a great honor to be here. Thank you all for coming and taking some of your time. And thanks to folks online. What I want to do this morning or this afternoon, forgive me, is to say a few words about these anniversaries, I should say. So in 1776, a small group of Unitarians began to meet here in Edinburgh. And at the same time, in fact, almost exactly 250 years ago, now that we're in the latter part of June, 250 years ago, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia and voted in favor of American independence on July 2nd. And these things may not seem related to you. And in fact, one of these things you may be more inclined to celebrate one of them than the other, I suspect. But I want to suggest to you that this isn't just a coincidence, but there's a correlation between these two events, and spend a few minutes reflecting on those connections and say a little bit about the history of Unitarianism, both here and in the United States. So, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, I should have begun by saying, this is being recorded. You're not being recorded, but the presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the St. Mark's website. So just so you know, we can stop the recording, or we can edit the recording I'm happy to take questions at the end, but if you don't want your question recorded, we don't have to share the Q&A at the end. So, and I want to thank everybody who's made this happen today, by the way. I should have begun with that, particularly Mimi, but you and Elise in the back have been helping, and so thank you for this. So the American Declaration of Independence famously begins with the statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It's a pretty good mission statement. As a statement, it's pretty good. There's a recent book that's been published by a man named Walter Isaacson with typical American understatement that has the title, "The Greatest Sentence Ever Written." I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it's a good sentence. It's a good mission statement. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So Thomas Jefferson of Virginia was the primary author of the American Declaration of Independence, and he wrote that sentence. Very interesting. An interesting dimension to it is in Jefferson later in life, he was sort of humble bragging and say, "Oh, it wasn't me, it wasn't that important." But he also said, "I just said what was in the air. I was just giving expression to the American mind." Now, the usual source that people go to understand American independence or the ideas behind independence, they often go to John Locke. And in Locke's treatise on government, second treatise on government, he references life and liberty, but it's life, liberty, and property. Where does the pursuit of happiness come from? Amazingly, and this probably won't surprise any of you, it comes from the Scots and the Scottish Enlightenment. I once had a student years and years ago who said, a British student said, "Well, of course, Americans would have the pursuit of happiness in their declaration because, it's got California." But no, the pursuit of happiness comes from Scotland. During the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson, who was actually born in Ulster, but who was professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, developed an idea in the mid-18th century that humans, we have our senses, taste, touch, smell, etc. He said there was a sense of happiness. And that sense of happiness wasn't the sense of happiness. It wasn't happiness as we kind of, well, not the good folk of St. Mark's, but as many people would identify it today, of like getting stuff and self-indulgence, but rather committing to social good. And that from that we derive happiness. And so that's the happiness in the American Declaration of Independence, which is a direct link to Scotland. There's a lot going on in 1776. And this is where I think we have not just coincidence, but correlation. Next slide, please. I was thinking about these remarks, and I was thinking about the old Buffalo Springfield song that begins, "There's something happening here." Because there was a lot going on in 1776. Adam Smith published the first volume of the Wealth of Nations. Edward Gibbon published the first volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. There's a lot of energy in the air. Unitarians begin to gather in Edinburgh. It should be said, when they gathered, denying the Trinity was a crime. So they did so at no small risk. Just as those men, and they were all men in Philadelphia, were risking their lives when they endorsed the Declaration of Independence, denying the authority of King George in the colonies. So what we see is a kind of efflorescence of ideas on both sides of the Atlantic. And it stresses, I think, the continuity between what was happening here and what was happening there. I think as somebody who teaches American history here in Britain, as somebody whose title is Professor of American History, I think the problem with the American Revolution is the name. We see it as an American event and it's nothing to do with Britain. It's 100% something to do with Britain. It's as much a British event as what we would come to think of as an American event. And I think we need to see it in that context. There's a transatlantic conversation going on. And the questioning of authority that we see in the colonies is not unlike the questioning of authority that we see in the formation of what will become St. Mark's and the creation of a Unitarian community here. Next slide, please. And a really good example of this transatlantic movement is Joseph Priestley. Unitarians don't have saints, but if they did, he's a pretty good candidate. So Joseph Priestley is an English Unitarian. He's a polymath. He's a really important scientist. He's an important historian. He's an important political thinker. He is also he's a very important Unitarian, and he publishes a number of works. He published over 150 works in the course of his life, but a couple of them were really, really germane to the Unitarian story, and I would argue to the formation of the United States. One is Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religion, which he published in 1772, so it's just on the eve of American independence. And then later, The History of the Corruptions of Christianity. The great thing about I do a lot of reading in 18th century works, and the great thing is they tell you exactly what the title tells you exactly what the book is about, which is very good because these books are often very long. But The History of the Corruptions of Christianity tells you his perspective there. But the Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religion, I think, is important because this book influenced Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Think back to that statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. The creator's there. There are people in the United States today who are quite committed to claiming that the country has a Christian founding. There's a big debate about this. I'm going to be working on a book on this, Janine, while I'm there. I don't believe that's true. The language in the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, makes reference, later it makes reference to the creator, a sort of general creator, not a Christian God. It also makes reference to that the Americans were faced with an intellectual and an ideological challenge when they declared independence. Previously, they said their rights came to them from the British Constitution. They always talked about that they possess the rights of Englishmen. That's their phrase, not mine. I know we're in Scotland. But they said, we have the rights of Englishmen. Once they declare independence, they don't. So they appeal to natural rights. They say their rights are universal. And so Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence references the creator. He also he says these rights come from nature, that is their natural, and nature's God. So he's playing to an audience that is predominantly Christian, and he's using language, this is a political statement, that won't offend people who believe in Christianity, but it's not explicitly Christian in my reading, and he will later become an advocate of the separation of church and state in the United States, which is incredibly important. That's one of his most important legacies. So I think, and Jefferson drew on Priestley and his reading of Priestley for that understanding of natural religion. So Priestley, in that 1772 book, Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religion, which Jefferson read, stressed that God could be found in nature. Priestley said, no miracles, or if there are miracles, they're the miracles of nature, not the miracles as described in the Bible. But we should be able to look to nature to understand God. He wasn't denying the existence of God, but he was saying that we can find God in nature. And that was something Jefferson was very, very comfortable with. Priestley's later book, which he went through what he believed were the corruptions of Christianity, was so controversial that he was threatened by a mob in Birmingham and his house was burned down and he went into exile in the United States. So he lived in the United States. He went to the newly independent United States seeking refuge. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about Jefferson's religious beliefs because they're really, really interesting. While president of the United States, and imagine this, he did a cut and paste job literally on the Bible, cutting out all the miracles and anything that couldn't be proved by reason. But in truth, it was the New Testament. So he looked at the New Testament and he did what would now be seen as kind of early biblical research. It's the kind of thing that people in schools of theology and divinity do all the time now. But he collated different translations of the Bible in Greek, in Latin, Hebrew, English, and French. He looked at the translations and he did a cut and paste job and he created two documents. One was called The Philosophy of Jesus. The other was The Life and Morals of Jesus, in which he basically took the Gospels and put them in order to try and make a coherent story. Because as some of you may know, the Gospels don't exactly line up necessarily. And so he basically, now you could say this is incredibly hubristic. Who does this guy think he is? He's going to say, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nice try, but let me do it. Let me help you out here. And that's more or less what he did. And he did this while he was president. Now, we would love a president who could read Greek and Latin and French and write and think. But you can imagine the political consequences if word got out that the president was cutting up the Bible. But which is what he did. Next slide, please. I'll give you an image of these were Jefferson's copies of some of his Bibles, and you can see, so he literally cut and pasted and put these together. The Jefferson Bible today, it's a lot shorter than the King James Bible, and it reads very, very well. And there's no resurrection. It ends with Jesus's death, and so they buried him. So he was denying. He said that Jesus was the greatest moral teacher who ever lived. He believed that he was a Christian in the only way somebody should be a Christian, which is living according to Jesus's teachings. But he denied the divinity of Jesus, which, of course, was anathema to many Protestants then and Catholics then as now. And so Jefferson's religious beliefs were unorthodox for that time. He described himself as a Unitarian. Next slide. At different points, the Unitarian congregation in Charlottesville, Virginia, is named for him. He, in the quote at the bottom there, and imagine this, confidently predicted in 1822, a few years before his death, I confidently expect that the present generation will see Unitarianism become the general religion of the United States.
Big words.
We're still waiting for that. But the reason he predicted that was because one of the consequences of the American Revolution, and this is a contribution that he helped make, was the disestablishment of church and state in all of the colonies that became independent states in 1776. There were state churches. And a debate arose about what the state church of the United States would be, because they were different. The Quakers and Presbyterians predominated in Pennsylvania. The Anglicans were dominant in Virginia. In New England, it was Congregationalism. And they feared, and Jefferson was aware of this, the prospect of religious warfare. They looked at the recent history of Europe and said, when people disagree over matters of faith, that's when you end up with violence and bloodshed. And so the answer was disestablishment. That is to take all support away, financial support from from churches, and churches having to support themselves. As Jill demonstrated earlier, this isn't easy. Churches finding the money to support themselves. If you can support St. Mark's, you should, please. So in Jefferson's Virginia, the Anglican Church was the established church. Two problems with that. One is King George is the head of the Anglican Church. That's a slight problem once you've declared independence and fought a war against the British. Secondly, taxes, people were paid taxes to support the church in Virginia. And non-Anglicans bridled against this and petitioned against it. And so we get Unitarians, relatively small numbers, of course, but also Baptists, Methodists, Quakers. There's a huge kind of coalition that represents a wide spectrum of belief of people who are non-Anglicans who say, our taxes shouldn't be used to support a church we don't believe in. And initially, there are compromises discussed. Okay, well, we'll give you like a voucher, and you can give it towards your church. But what they settle on, and the laws eventually adopted in 1786, is a law that says church and state should be separated in Virginia. It's the first time it happens in the United States. It's one of the first times in modern history, and that will become the basis for the subsequent First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that separates church and state in the United States. And Jefferson, his thinking on this is the quote you see on the left at the top, is one of my favorite Jefferson quotes. It's from a book he wrote called The Notes on the State of Virginia. There's a section in there where he's writing about religion. And he says, he emphasizes there that he's talking about disestablishment and the separation of church and state. He says, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. My favorite Jefferson quote. Yeah. I don't think he'd want us to say amen, but amen. Next slide. Now, I'm just giving you the good Jefferson. When Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, he enslaved more than 200 men, women, and children. Over the course of his life, he enslaved at least 607 people that we can identify. He lived a very long time. His first memory, he says this in his autobiography, was being carried on a pillow by an enslaved Black person. The very last thing he said on his deathbed, he asked a slave who was attending him to adjust the pillow on his head as he was dying. So his entire life was encompassed and made possible by enslavement. And we have to reckon with this. Doesn't necessarily relate to his religious views. In fact, I don't think it relates to his religious views, but it's important to qualify this. But there's a lot of change going on. There's something happening here. Well, Buffalo Springfield again. And people are questioning things. They're questioning the Trinity here in Scotland. They're questioning governments limiting of their rights on both sides of the Atlantic. And people are questioning slavery. And what you have there is a picture of a man named Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes needs to be much better known than he is. He's the first Black man to be ordained as a minister in America. In 1776, he wasn't yet a minister. He was 23 years old. He was living in Massachusetts. And he read the Declaration of Independence. He was free. And he saw that statement, all men are created equal. And he said, well, hold on a second. What about slavery? And he wrote a pamphlet come sermon about this. And what Haynes said that was really interesting, and you've got a bit of a quote there, he made the argument that slavery had no justification. Not most people, sorry, let me back up. The people who were anti-slavery at this point were making the anti-slavery case usually based on natural rights, human rights. So and then we have a lot of Quakers doing it in this period. We have people in America, both black and white, doing it. Haynes is interesting to me because he justified his opposition not in political ideology, but in scripture. Haynes was a man of faith. He wasn't a Unitarian, he became a Congregationalist. But he said there's no justification for slavery in the Bible, racial slavery. Now, there were lots of people who read the Bible differently. There was a version of the Bible that circulated in the United States and in the British Caribbean called the Slave's Bible that was edited to make slavery, to justify slavery and justify enslavement. Haynes was challenging that, and he wrote, "Therefore, we may reasonably conclude that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage equally intolerable to the one as to the other." That's the standard and quite just and correct criticism of slavery that was being made in response to the Declaration of Independence. Samuel Johnson, the famous English lexicographer, said of the American rebels, "Why is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" And that's a valid criticism at the time. There's no question about it. But then Haynes continued, "There is not the least precept or practice in the sacred scriptures that constitutes a black man a slave any more than a white one." So Haynes, as a 23-year-old, who was at that point a soldier fighting in the Patriot Army that was supporting independence or fighting for independence from Britain, made this case, made a direct connection that Jefferson was unwilling to make about slavery. Next slide. And he wasn't alone. I'm mindful of the fact that this is a predominantly female congregation at the moment in gathering. Women, all men are created equal. Well, what do we mean by that? We used to just be able to say, well, yeah, they meant women. Of course, they meant women too. And it's not that simple, of course. In the 18th century, the use of man to mean humanity was common and was used, but we can't necessarily take that for granted. And there are two women, and Jefferson, when it comes to women, his record is a little bit mixed, so we can leave him behind on that. But I want to call your attention to this woman who should also be better known. Her name is Elizabeth Freeman. By coincidence, she was also from Massachusetts. She was enslaved. Massachusetts adopted a constitution after independence in 1780. Declaring independence, as the colonies did in 1776, necessitated creating new constitutions. One of the great innovations of the American Revolution, the Americans believed, and Americans still celebrate this, is we have a written constitution. That prevents problems. So all the states adopt new constitutions, then we get the new federal constitution in 1787, and Americans have been historically quite proud of their constitution, but also a little smug about it, like, well, this is what we do better than the British. The British have a constitution, but it's unwritten, and that's a bit of a mess. It could lead to corruption and abuse. We could never have that. So, we learned that a written constitution is a barrier against any abuse. I mean, certainly, to be sure. So Massachusetts adopts its own constitution in the 1780s. And it says, it uses the language, a variant of the language in the Declaration of Independence. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties. It's not as poetic as that sentence Jefferson wrote, but it's the same point. Elizabeth Freeman sued for her freedom based on this clause in the Massachusetts Constitution. The Declaration of Independence isn't legally binding. It's a declaration. A constitution is legally binding. So one way we can deal with the apparent hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence and that flowery phrase, all men are created equal, is say, that's really nice, but it's not binding. It's a statement. The law, the language in the Massachusetts Constitution was legally binding. And on the basis of that, Elizabeth Freeman sued for her freedom and won. And slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts overnight by judicial decision. Now, there weren't that many enslaved people in Massachusetts, so it didn't have the economic impact it would have had elsewhere, but this is a really important step. And other women are also, next slide, please, asking for I won't read you this entire quote, but it's a very famous one, asking for their rights in this context as well. So they're going further. This is Abigail Adams. She was famously married to John Adams, who was a leading revolutionary. In March of 1776, she knew Congress was just debating whether to declare independence or not. She wrote to her husband, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary to make, I desire you would remember the ladies." What she goes on there, she's being quite specific about it. Like, okay, if we declare independence, it will be necessary to draft new laws and new constitutions. So we have a chance to begin the world anew. And she said, remember the ladies when you do this. And what she means by this, she goes on in the quote, is she wants more liberal divorce laws and property laws. She's quite specific what she's asking for. Now, on one hand, this is conservative because she's recognizing the authority of men like her husband, John, to make these decisions and draft these laws. But she's asking for a kind of, well, not kind of, she's asking for a liberalization of those laws. And she says, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. The Americans have been complaining for a decade about no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation. We're not represented in Parliament. We're not subject to Parliament. She said, well, you know who else isn't represented? Well, you, not me. And if you do this, we can rebel too. They had a very, very close and happy marriage, John and Abigail. John, however, wrote back to her, as to your suggestion, your code of laws, I cannot but laugh. This was a very, very bad response from John. And she wrote back immediately, I wasn't kidding. Just, to read this entire correspondence is very, very enlightening and very revealing. So just to be clear on this, I wasn't kidding. And what the revolution does result in a liberalization of some laws when it comes to gender. Not complete equality, although, and this is one for if you're ever at a quiz night, the first women to vote in America, in the United States, voted in New Jersey in the 1790s. The New Jersey Constitution allowed women to vote, and women voted for about 15 years in New Jersey. New Jersey is often subject to jokes and disrespect from other Americans. It's not a state other Americans have like a lot, but New Jersey has the distinction. New Jerseyites should be very proud that theirs was the first state in which women could vote. They were ultimately disenfranchised in the early 19th century, but women could vote in New Jersey in the 1790s and early years of the 19th century. Next slide. In 1848, when the first Women's Rights Convention was held in the United States, in Seneca Falls, New York, it adopted something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments was a rephrasing of the Declaration of Independence in what we would call gender-neutral language. So it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal and endowed by their Creator, and on it goes. Among the women who drafted that was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Stanton, she wasn't a Unitarian necessarily, but she was Unitarian curious. She was a very liberal Quaker. And of course, the Quakers and Unitarians have always found fellow feeling with each other as dissenters and slightly heterodox thinkers. And Stanton comes from that tradition. But Margaret Fuller, what we see by the 1830s and 40s is, and when this beautiful building was built in 1835, is over the coming decades, that questioning of authority, that emphasis on reason has spread, and Unitarianism flourishes in both Britain and the United States in the subsequent decades. And I think that Women's Rights Convention in 1848 is a reflection of that. And what's very interesting is a lot of the early leaders of American Unitarianism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, were direct descendants of men and women who had supported the American Revolution. Their fathers and mothers had been quite prominent revolutionaries. Which brings us back to Jefferson, inadequate as he is in some ways, but he was a visionary. He put three things on his tombstone. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He'd served as American ambassador in France. He'd been the first Secretary of State of the United States. He'd been vice president. He did 2 terms as president. He put three things on his tombstone. Author of the Declaration of American Independence. Author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That was the law that disestablished religion in Virginia. And father of the University of Virginia. Late in life, he helped establish a university. And that university, which exists today as the University of Virginia, was secular. Every other institution of higher learning in the new United States had a religious foundation. Virginia did not. And he actively sought Unitarians to come and teach at the university. He wanted a man named William Bentley, who was a Unitarian minister in Salem, Massachusetts, to come and be the president. And Bentley was so attached to his congregation that he wouldn't go. So Unitarianism plays a role in the founding of the United States. The principles of Unitarianism, free inquiry, freedom of thought, that inspired our forebears who gathered here 250 years ago, helped. It's not the only source. I don't want to overstate this, but certainly played a prominent role in the creation of the United States. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.